Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. Well, hello everyone and welcome to my library. My name is Cinzia if you are new here, and today we're going to be talking about hell, more specifically literary hell, that of Dante Alighieri's 14,233 line narrative poem, The Divine Comedy, written between circa 1308 and 1320. It is one of the most profound visionary constructs of the Western idea of hell, one which not only went on to inspire Western Renaissance artists and centuries of literature and poetry, but was so influential that it established Florentine Tuscan as the standardized Italian language that we know today. However, I say that it's important to note that the Italian that we know today is somewhat of a new thing in terms of prominence. The country of Italy didn't actually finally become a thing until 1861, and then back then, only, get this, 2.5% of the population spoke the Italian that we know today. Even up until 1951, less than 20% of the Italians used Italian exclusively in their daily lives. I only just learned this recently, had to share it, thought it was fascinating. But now let's get into Dante's poem. So Dante's poem takes us through the 9 concentric circles of hell via the protagonist, who is Dante himself, led by his guide, the classical poet Virgil. And the two of them together witness in detail the horrific fates of the lustful, the gluttonous, violent sinners, the traitors and the heretics. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're right, it doesn't exactly sound like a light-hearted entertainment, and it isn't. So you're probably wondering why it's called the Divine Comedy. Well, the title of the poem takes after the ancient Greek tradition of comedic and tragic plays. Commedia referred to a play that begins sad but ends happy, which in Christian terms is what Dante's Divine Comedy does. It's a dark story, but with a happy ending. Christian salvation and heaven. But before we go any further, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, which is Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. Whether you're just starting out or managing a growing brand, Squarespace makes it easy for you to create a beautiful website, engage with your audience, and sell anything from products to time to courses, all in one place and all on your terms. Are you new to building websites? Well, you don't have to be frightened about it because you can design a gorgeous, unique and professional looking website tailored to your brand, all thanks to Squarespace Blueprint. And with Squarespace's integrated optimized SEO tools, you can get your new website launched and discovered quickly. And you don't need to know anything about coding, thanks to Squarespace's next generation website editor called Fluid Engine, which lets you just drag and drop your content where you want it, whether you're using a desktop or your mobile. And if you're a freelance creative wanting to launch your own courses, then Squarespace is the place for you. Because you can actually upload your videos directly onto Squarespace and put them behind a paywall and then set your own prices, whether that's a subscription service, a one-time fee, whatever works for your brand. So if you are interested in starting your own website with Squarespace, whether for your business or for personal leisure, then go to squarespace.com and start a free trial. And then when you're ready to launch it, go to squarespace.com/lady of the library to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So Dante's Inferno, the first part of the Divine Comedy, begins with our poet traversing lost through an unforgiving forest before he ascends towards the Forbidden Mountains. As he climbs, his path is blocked by 3 beasts, a leopard, a lion, and a she-wolf. Naturally terrified, Dante runs back to the forest and encounters the ghost of Virgil. Virgil is there to guide Dante through hell before he can reach heaven, where his beloved Beatrice is waiting for him. I know, so romantic. I just go to a coffee shop for most of my first dates, but whatever. Each realm of his journey is filled with Dante's horror, the doubt, the dread, the bewilderment, as he travels from one world to the next. So as Dante and Virgil cross the infernal gate of hell, we'll come to that later, don't worry, they enter a kind of vestibule, an anti-inferno, where the souls of those who were not good or evil in life now run through putrid mud in a futile chase after a blank flag that rapidly changes positions. all whilst they're being stung and bitten by hornets and wasps and worms lap up their blood. I know, a bit gross, isn't it? But the tears and blood that they shed day after day is the price that they are to pay for those they did not shed for others whilst they were alive. There is a notable historical figure alluded to in this scene, Celestine V. So let's get into Celestine V because it's interesting. Pope Celestine V appears as a nameless figure in the realm. Quote, "I saw and recognised a shade of him, who due to cowardice made the great refusal." Now some believe it's Pontius Pilate, but most researchers believe it's Celestine V, so let's talk about him more. Born 1215, Celestine V was a monk and a hermit who founded the Order of the Celestine. He left his monastery in 1239 and retreated from the world to live in a cave located near Mount Morone, or Mount Morone. I've heard it pronounced different ways, but also absolute goals. He lives alone for 5 years until other hermits joined him, which to me defeats the point of the object. He's a hermit, but anyway, a new community forms around him. Again, not what he wanted, I completely relate. So Celestine V, whose name before his papacy was Pietro, was not a fan of being in charge of nearly, get this, 600 monks across 36 monasteries, which all became following him over the years. I know, that's really irritating. He went into the mountain to be alone and everyone copied him. Trendsetter. So obviously not wanting to be in charge, he passes leadership on to another person, and then he finally got to live an anchrotic life for a few more decades until his world was changed for the worse in his opinion. So in 1292, Pope Nicholas IV passed away and the papal conclave extended for 2 years without being able to choose a successor. Now this is a big deal, and unfortunately Pietro dug himself his own grave by making the mistake of sending the cardinals a letter reproaching them for the situation and warning them of divine vengeance. Before that point, Pietro was unknown to them, but the dean of the College of Cardinals, Latino Malabranca, was inspired by this letter from Pietro. So he proposed Pietro become the successor. Pietro not only tried to refuse the position, he tried to flee his fate, but there was no escape. He was not only confronted with the delegation of cardinals, but also the King of Naples and the Prince of Hungary. And by July 1294, the once reclusive hermit was now Pope at the age of 79. Now he was regarded by many as a weak and incompetent pope, primarily because he chose Naples as his seat instead of Rome. And Naples fell under the influence of King Charles II, who kind of manipulated Pietro for his own benefit. Or rather, he's now Celestine V. Celestine V resigned just 5 months later in December of 1294. Unfortunately, now back as Pietro, he wasn't allowed to return to his life of solitude because the new Pope, Boniface VIII, feared that Pietro would be established as an anti-pope. I know, Pietro wants nothing to do with any of them. However, to prevent the anti-pope from being formed, he ordered Pietro to accompany him to Rome. But during the journey, Pietro escaped from the carriage and ran into the woods and attempted to return to his life of solitude. However, naturally, as a man who was nearly in his 80s, he was kind of easily caught, though not in the way you would think. He managed to get onto a ship on the way to Dalmatia, but it was forced to return to the port during a storm, and that is where Boniface had him arrested. Poor Pietro died in prison 10 months later. But this, they believe, is the cowardice that Dante wrote of in this realm. Now, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky here and skip ahead to another character who will appear later in the poem, but whose name I just brought up here. Boniface VIII. Boniface VIII will appear later in the 8th Circle of Hell, but we'll cover him now because we've kind of mentioned him and we're on a bit of a history kick, and you may forget him by the time we're on the 8th Circle of Hell. So Boniface VIII just so happened, okay, get this, to be Dante's personal and public enemy number 1. See, Boniface's pontificate was marked by a consolidation and expansion of church power based on the belief that the Pope was not only the spiritual head of Christendom, but also superior to the emperor in the secular temporal realm. Dante, however, wrote a treaty where he stated he believed that the Pope and the emperor should have equal balance between them, but with the Pope leading in the spiritual authority and the emperor in the secular authority. Boniface was placed in the city of Florence under an interdict and invited to enter in 1300s to end a feud between the black and the white Guelphs. And one of the leaders of the Guelphs, the white Guelph in particular, just so happened to be Dante. Oh no, look, another rabbit hole that we're going down in this little tiny talk about hell. Excellent, I know, I love it. So what was the feud between the black and white Guelphs about? I mean, okay, fine, let's go into that. Okay, we have to go back even further. The Guelphs and the Ghibellines were two groups in medieval Italy who backed the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor between the 12th and the 13th centuries. But the origins of their rivalry dated back even further to the investiture controversy, which lasted between 1075 and 1122. So this earlier controversy revolved around the question of who held the authority to appoint bishops and abbots. I know, really? That's what lasted nearly 100 years? Okay, fine. Anyway, okay, so the Ghibellini faction believed that imperial authority should control the papal influence, whilst the Guelph faction believed the Holy Roman Empire should have greater authority. But obviously, there are always factions within factions, and this one in question happened to be the Florentine black and white Guelphs. The black Guelphs were avid supporters of papacy. They believed that the church should have control over political and social landscapes. So obviously the white Guelphs were pretty pro-church as well. However, they believed city-states should be independent from control of the church. So they believed the church should have some power, and that power should be over Christendom matters, and the emperor should have control over civic matters. Well, so King Charles's intervention allowed for the black Guelphs to overthrow the ruling white Guelphs, resulting in a spree of violence and political reprisals against the former rulers. So whilst travelling to Rome to entreat Pope Boniface VIII for peace, Dante was falsely accused of corruption by the black Guelphs. And to make matters worse, the white Guelphs, which he was one of the leaders of, accused Dante of collaborating with the black Guelphs in an attempt to deal with the papacy. Obviously, Dante refused to admit to crimes he hadn't committed, so he was fined. But because his assets had been confiscated, he wasn't able to pay any of the fines and was thus exiled from Florence. And were he ever to return to Florence, he faced being burnt at the stake. So Dante sought his revenge in poetry, as all good villains do. Now what he does, we will see when we get into another video where we talk about the 8th circle of hell. So remember the story for when that video comes about, you'll refer to it here. We'll talk about the fate of Boniface VIII in the 8th circle of hell. I know, that's poetic as well. 8th circle, 8th, I know. I'm not sure if that was intended, but you know. Now, before we go back to joining Dante and Virgil in the antechamber just after the gates of hell, let's talk about where is hell? Because Dante not only gave us a location of hell, but also the structure of hell. So Dante described hell as a giant cone situated beneath Jerusalem, with its circles reducing in diameter as it burrowed down towards the centre of the earth. Such a description, as you can imagine, naturally spurred cartographical interests, with the earliest that we know of coming from Antonio Manetti, a Florentine mathematician and architect who believed it was possible to map out the precise shape, size and location of Dante's hell. So Manetti was a mathematician, but he actually never published his calculations of hell, but his work was included in other people's works, including Cristoforo Landino, Girolamo Benivieni, and Galileo Galilei. Am I the only one who finds his name really funny? I know I shouldn't find it funny, but I really find it funny saying Galileo Galilei. Anyway, sorry, it's a child. So Galilei delivered 2 lectures in 1588 at the Florentine Academy on the topography of Dante's hell. Galileo not only concluded in Manetti's favour, but he also attempted to calculate his own structural engineering of Dante's hell. So starting with Dante's line that, quote, "But then the sun had come to the horizon, the circle of whose meridian at its high point covers Jerusalem, and night circling on the opposite side, was emerging from the Ganges with scales that fall out of her hands and when she prevails. Now that line is from Purgatory Canto 2. Galileo hypothesized that hell's upper diameter was equal to the radius of the earth, with the boundary of hell's roof running from beneath Marseille, France in the west and stretching east across to Tashkent, which is now Uzbekistan. I can never say that correctly, Uzbekistan. Anyway, he also made his calculations for the density of hell's roof, using the figures for Brunelleschi's design of the Duomo in Florence, which is 45 meters wide and 3 meters deep. Now, by scaling this up to the size of hell, Galileo concluded that the roof of hell would have been 370 miles or 600 kilometers thick. And as you can imagine, these figures don't hold up, pun intended, as hell would easily collapse under the weight of its own roof, which I suppose is kind of ironic if it was like a Greek mythology where it just kept doing that every day and everyone was crushed to death. Anyway, Sandro Botticelli, who you may know as one of the most famous painters of The Birth of Venus, he also painted a glorious map of Dante's Hell between 1480s and 1490s as part of a commission for an edition of the Divine Comedy for the Medici family, who were his primary funders throughout the entirety of his life. They loved his work. He was basically set for life with them. Now, you will see through all these paintings I've shown you from these artists and Dante's poem itself that there is a massive mixture of classical and pagan imagery as well as Christian imagery. This is a big deal, and we see this straight off the bat. Obviously we have Virgil, but then when Dante and Virgil move into hell, they have to board a boat alongside the ferryman Charon or Haron, it varies, which takes them across the river of Acheron and into the real border of hell. Now, I won't go into detail here about Charon and the process of going into the underworld by a boat, because I have a whole video about underworld in Greek mythology where I cover everything in depth. So that's there if you're interested. I think it's that corner right there. However, Dante's decision to mix the imagery with Christian and pagan symbolism is a really important one, which shall be highlighted throughout this whole video series as we go through all the circles of hell. Let's return to the beginning of Canto 3, in which Dante and Virgil pass under the gates of hell. The canto opens with the words written over the gates of hell, culminating in the most famous line, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." But what does it mean, the quote above the gates, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here"? Well, we'll see that as we go through each of the circles of hell. This is going to be quite a long series, but if you have any similar requests for any other hellscapes or underworlds you'd like me to cover in video, please consider sending me a request. I have a Google form where you can send all your requests in for me. And also please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. Thank you as always to my patrons for making this possible. Have a wonderful day. I hope you are happy and healthy. And remember, books save lives. So keep reading.